Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending. We have this digital service for the planet initiative slide as you come in, and we just wanted to share this. We have signed on to this initiative. It rests on 3 key recommendations meant to ensure that environmental agencies that work on conservation, climate, and wildlife and water can leverage the necessary technology to bring natural resource planning and stewardship to the 21st century. And if you're at this lunch and learn, I bet you're into that. So really wanted to share this with you. Please check out that link and check it out and sign on if that's the appropriate thing for you to do. All right, so now we'll get to our guest. We are so excited. This is our second lunch and learn with a regulator as one of the guests. And, you know, one of the best, absolute best parts of my job is that I get to talk to people like Mark Sudol. We kind of like to, we've lately called them wild nerds. And that is because they are nerding out on technology and the environment essentially. And that is one of the ways you can describe, one of the many ways you can describe Mark. And I will introduce him more formally in a minute, but welcome everyone. This is our 17th episode of our Lunch and Learn series. And we've got a lot of new people that have signed up today. So thank you for that. And the point of this is to look at how different industry professionals are using new technologies to streamline problematic compliance tasks. Our guest today is Mark Sudol, who I talked about earlier. Like I said, I'll introduce him in a minute. Okay, I'm the host, Kristen Hazard, founder and CEO of Wildnote. Wildnote is an environmental compliance automation platform built specifically for environmental consultants, permittees, and regulators. Our Chief Revenue Officer, Jeff Aramospe, is here. Hi, Jeff.
Hello, Kristen.
All right, and our Director of Customer Success, Nancy Douglas, is also with us.
Hello.
All right, so quick housekeeping. Please use the chat window to interact and post questions for the panel. And please use the Q&A window for technical questions or if you need help during the webinar. And Nancy, I think you'll be tracking those for us.
Yep, we track the questions, you betcha.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so Mark Sudol's diverse career has included time flying military jets from aircraft carriers. Hello. 30 years of work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and several stints in the private sector as a wetland consultant. Throughout his career, he has focused on the importance of using data to guide policy decisions and has worked to help regulatory agencies adopt accurate and integrated data as a cornerstone of future policy and environmental protection. That's a wonderful mission. And that's what we are going to focus on today. After serving time as the Chief of Regulatory Programs in the Los Angeles District, he was selected to serve as the Chief of Regulatory Programs at headquarters. During his tenure, he oversaw many high-profile permit actions, developed guidance for 2 Supreme Court rulings. I think this is SWANC or SWANCC, and then Carabel Rapina, which I hear about all the time, that one. And in cooperation with EPA, issued the mitigation rule. He also worked personally with the OMB to increase funding for the regulatory program from 140 to 190 million. He attributes the success of this budget increase directly to the use of permit data collected nationwide. Mark transferred to the Institute for Water Resources in 2008, where he became the Director of Navigation and Civil Works Decision Support Center. Mark led a group of interdisciplinary personnel to manage collection and analysis of navigation data for the Corps, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, and the Coast Guard. He was also the Senior Program Manager leading the organization and consolidation of the many core databases, combining operational data with geospatial analytical tools. This effort also included development of a suite of decision support tools that provided access to both real-time and historic data to improve senior leaders' ability to manage the core, operational programs, and support budget development. Mark retired from the federal service in 2020 and has established his own consulting firm specializing in support for complex wetland permits, strategic infrastructure management, disaster preparedness, and assisting with true IWRM, integrated water resource management. Welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, folks from Wildnote.
All right. So
glad to have you.
We like to start every episode with a story from the field. Any wonderful, sublime, crazy, wacky story you want to tell us that you've had out in the field, Mark?
Sure. I think my favorite one is, as you all know, I got my dissertation working for the Los Angeles district in evaluating mitigation sites. And little known is that only one person ever went twice when I was doing my data collection on mitigation areas. And that was my wife. And the second time she went, we had to cross a field to get to our riparian area to collect the data. And there was a herd of bulls, steers, that was out there. And we were in hiking boots and had red flags on our back. And she was worried that the bulls would attack us. And they didn't, thank goodness. But she drew the line at the bulls at that point and said, no, I'm not going to the field anymore. So all that data I had to collect and then write it down myself and then convert it to electronic format later. And that was the first time I realized that collecting data electronically makes things a lot easier.
You know, as a software person sitting in my air-conditioned office, I was surprised to learn at the varied field conditions that people are faced with. And I was just sort of thinking it was all sublime, you know, beautiful nature.
No.
Not the case, right?
Yep.
So, all right. Well, now we'll get to our problem solved segment. And first, I'd just like to start, kind of take a step back and talk about what is the role of the Corps in regulating wetlands?
Okay. The Corps regulates wetlands under the Clean Water Act. And they were given that authority because back in the 1890s, Congress established the Rivers and Harbors Act and gave the Corps of Engineers authority to look at actions that stop navigation on the rivers, bridge building. There was a lot of things going on in the late 1890s after the Civil War of states and other local entities building bridges and stopping navigation for different reasons. So they put the Corps in charge of that way back when. And when Congress was writing the Clean Water Act in the 70s, they thought because the Corps already had a regulatory authority, they gave them access over the Section 404, which means if you put fill or any kind of fill material into a wetland or water, you have to get a permit from the Corps. That's really why the Corps not only has authority, but was given authority back in the day.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, so what are some of the biggest challenges you saw facing the Corps with respect to regulating wetlands?
Yeah, workload. The Corps does a great job. And again, I'm not speaking for the Corps anymore, but as the chief of regulatory and working for the Corps for a number of years, the Corps does a great job of doing its mission and trying to get these permits out the door. But unfortunately, as with any federal agency, the amount of funding you get is never really enough. And that's why I highlighted the issue of using data to get more funding from OMB. Anytime you can get OMB to give an agency more data, you have to document that. And that's where I think one of the first uses or realization of data and how important it is to that. So the regulator in the field has a huge workload, sometimes 100 permit files on his or her desk. And having data at their fingertips in an electronic format without having to enter that information, without having to write it all down or write stuff and really trying to automate many of the tasks would help the Corps a lot. And that's where that data piece that you guys are doing comes in.
Right.
Some of the technology that you have in other agencies to integrate and automate that data and make it easier for them to do their job.
Perfect. So this sort of leads into our, if you were king of the wetland universe and you could decide how the Corps received and analyzed data in order to advance the mission of the Corps, what would that look like?
Yeah, so, and we talked about this a little bit, but really it gets back to automating the data so that when data came into the Corps could accept that automated data, whether it be from Wildnote information on wetland delineation notes, and then taking the information and using AI and machine learning techniques to check. So for example, when you have a wetland delineation pit that's out there.
Yeah.
You have the lat long on that pit, then you can go back and use, when the information came into the core, you can use AI type algorithms to go back and check, compare it to Department of Agriculture soil maps. So is that pit in a reasonable location? Does it have the same characteristics as the area that it will be under in the soil pit? So you could do a quick and dirty QA, QC on that information without the regulator having to do much. And then that algorithm could flag the regulator saying this either looks okay or it doesn't.
Right.
So you still have the ability to have the regulator check the data, but you have this automated system that could look and check that. And you could do that with a number of things in the regulatory community, bringing in data, compare and contrast habitat. There's a lot of geospatial data out there that could be used in the same way to assist the regulator. And then that would also help on a number of other levels, not only for the regulator, but it would help the public. Because then the public would have faster access and faster decisions on their permits. It would also help the environmental community then, because now you have that data is now in a database that can be used to deal with cumulative impacts. One of the friends of mine out in California, Eric Stein, he did his dissertation on the idea of cumulative impacts, but he came up with an idea that not only the Corps can't stop permitting, but what it can do is ratchet that permit mechanism into a higher and higher analysis. So you stop using certain general permits or nationwide and do more individual permits. So it gives the environmental community an ability to look at this and make decisions on when you can shift to higher permit analysis. So using data really helps across the wide spectrum of the regulatory program for the Corps in that manner.
Right. When we had talked pre-production, I think you talked about better GIS tools, inclusion of LiDAR data and the NWI data set. Is that right?
Yes.
And
right. So go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, okay. For those of you know, I think most folks now understand LiDAR and the ability to get high resolution data on elevations and topography, and that can be used to come in and use not only for the delineation areas for streams and wetlands and things like that, but it can also use for restoration areas to see if there are habitat heterogeneity and other things when there is a restoration site or a mitigation bank site. Are we doing the direct thing? I believe we can also enhance the NWI maps. Again, with that same idea, using machine learning or AI tools to say, hey, is this the first cut on the wetland?
Right.
The other thing, the Corps does a lot of preliminary JDs now. And could we work through the regulations to put a procedure in using the NWI maps or revised NWI maps, give the Fish and Wildlife additional funds to put higher resolution NWI maps and use that as a preliminary or JD, so that you don't have to go out and visit everyone. The Corps can do that with some maps and stuff like that. So again, streamlining and processing that information to make better and faster permit decisions.
Faster permit decisions, yeah. So when the permit decisions are being made, that is at the watershed level, is that right?
In general, the Corps is broken out in 38 districts across the country by state and local boundaries, but all boundaries are decided by watersheds. And if you think about the Corps managing water, it kind of makes sense that the Corps manage these permits by watershed, because the top of the watershed all the way down to the bottom. So the Corps generally uses 8-unit HUC codes, USGS HUC codes, to manage it, but they can be bigger or smaller depending on the area or the region. And if you look at that as a boundary for the cumulative impacts, that kind of makes sense. And using LiDAR and other aerial photography and satellite imagery to get a sense what's going on in that watershed, then you can make that determination of the cumulative impacts in that watershed, of how you want to process permits in that watershed.
Okay, that makes sense. So if that watershed's doing really good, basically, then you may go ahead with the permit because overall it's fine. It's
correct. And also, but where's the location of that permit?
Okay.
Is it in an area that causes significant harm downstream or upstream?
Right.
You have to look at the landscape nature of that and where it fits in. And that's one of the things the Corps is hard to do at times without some of that geospatial information right at the fingertips of that regulator. He or she can then look at it. Okay. And also then build the mechanisms in or determine how those impacts are dealt with.
Right. And so we have at Wildnote, we have the wetland determination form that gets submitted to the Corps. that comes right out of our system. And I was wondering, what is a day in the life of a wetland determination form that's submitted to the Corps? What happens?
Well, yeah. Again, I haven't dealt with permits in about 20 years, so this is I might be a little behind the scenes. But when I dealt with it, again, I don't think it's changed much. But again, I don't know. But they would be part of the official Corps record file. Mm-hmm. Very few are going to actually be converted into an electronic format or put into a database because, again, the regulators just don't have the time to take that data and convert it or accept data in.
Right.
The government has, and especially the Corps of Engineers, has a lot of restrictions because the Army Corps of Engineers are part of Big Army.
Right.
So there's hardwired connections between the Corps databases and Army databases. So the level of cybersecurity is much higher. So accepting public data is one of those things that's very hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it, excuse me, current situation doesn't allow that. So we have to find a way to bring it in and convert it from electronic into electronic and use a way to check it. You can be, there's a lot of problems. We did a couple trials years ago, back in the early 2000s. And a couple times we had people spoofing the data and putting in, massive amounts of data to try to overwhelm the database.
Oh, wow.
So that was happening, and opponents will do that to try to shut down the Corps' database. So there are reasons why the Corps can't accept data, but I think we've got to get over that and find ways to accept it. Again, once you move our database, the Corps databases from internal to the cloud, that will allow a change in how the data is dealt with.
Being accepted, And do you see a timeline on that potentially happening?
Yes, that was my last job in terms of organizing the data, and we worked with the Army. Again, this is about 5 years ago, to move some of the Corps databases to the Amazon cloud.
Right.
And we didn't have anything good or bad against Amazon, but that was a recommendation by Army based on the characteristics of our data, which database we used. And we used a contract with DOI to do that. Mm-hmm. Now, I know the regulatory database was part of those that were going to be transferred over. And a year ago, it hadn't been done yet. And I believe it was due to be done this year or next year. There was a plan to move it all within 3 to 5 years.
Okay. 3 to 5 years a year ago, basically.
Yes.
Okay. So do you think that then at that point, Wildnote and other apps like Wildnote will be able to send like an electronic file to the Corps?
Yeah, I believe that the Corps is going to start finding ways to do that, because there are several initiatives to move data from public sector or public entities into the database, and there are ways to do that electronically now. Understand the Corps can't mandate the use of Wildnote, but if if the Corps puts out a standard for their data transmission, if Wildnote meets that standards, then data can come right into the Corps, and there's options to validate that data and or check it using some basic tools like AI and machine learning.
And as far as now, we have this National Wetlands Inventory. Are the determination forms related to that at all, or is that completely separate?
Technically, it's completely separate. However, I know people use those forms to check as a baseline.
Right.
If you're out there and you're doing a wetland and the NWI map says there's a very large wetland there, and you're in the middle of that wetland and you try to argue there's no wetlands there, that's going to come across as big red flag. On the opposite, though, there may be areas where there's not enough granularity on the NWI map or mapping techniques, and they may miss certain wetlands. So that's the issue. We have to get a little better granularity. Also, understand NWI maps are done by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're a completely separate agency from the Corps, and they work completely different. There's a whole website on how NWI maps are done through the Fish and Wildlife Service and how they do their systems, and it's not connected to the Corps directly at all.
Right. Interesting.
Would it make sense for them to be connected, for that data set just to grow larger, or?
It has to do with agency missions and habitat. Fish and Wildlife is looking at habitats and mapping habitat, where the Corps primarily is doing permitting. So we take the information from the service and use it to make permit decisions. So you'd have to either plus up the Corps with additional funding to have them either assist or take over the mapping. But there would be that a little bit of internal food fight in the agencies about whose mission it is.
Right.
So that's one of those things with the agencies to determine.
Now, once the permit's given, is the work done with the Corps then? There's
no, the Corps generally has requirements to do compliance checks. However, again, because of funding and personnel, not a lot of those aren't done. There's too much of a workload getting permits out the door, issuing the issues, and you do some compliance checks, but you don't really have a lot of time and effort to check to see if the permit was done as it was written. Mm-hmm. Again, using technology like Wildnote, you could get information on that.
Yeah.
The compliance efforts are really done on any required mitigation in most cases. Mm-hmm. And again, that's where your technology can come in. Mm-hmm. The success criteria of that mitigation, if we could use it electronically and make it part of a database, then the agency could check it much quicker than looking through voluminous mitigation reports and making decisions that way.
And that's essentially mitigation banking you're referencing there?
It can be, it's a mix. The Corps doesn't always require mitigation banks, but they'd like to if they can. Yeah. But you also give the applicant, if he or she wants to do its own standalone mitigation site, if it meets the criteria of the Corps and it looks like it's going to be successful, you can allow that to happen. Mm-hmm. But again, several hoops to jump through before that does.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it could be either.
Okay. Have you done much work with rapid assessment methods?
I've had a little bit here and there. I worked with the HCM method, and I worked with folks in California on the CRAM method and things like that. So again, very data intensive in collecting data, not only to validate the model, but to collect data to make those determinations. Anything that we can do and make those electronically would be much welcomed by regulators in the field.
Do you think there's too much data collected for what you need to make decisions on, or what's your thoughts about that?
Let me digress for a second. Data is very good, but if you collect data without thought on the decisions you're trying to make, it can be overwhelming, and it can lead you down different paths. Yeah. So what you really need to do is think about the decision. What are you trying to do? What's your role? What's your mission? What are you trying to do?
Right.
If you collect all the data in the world, is that really going to help you? Or is it just going to fill up a large database that you have to then sift through?
Right.
If you focus on what's required and what's important and collect that information to then do the analysis to get to a decision, that makes it very useful. So collecting data for data's sake never works.
Right.
But collecting targeted data to make better decisions is what I've seen to become very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where electronically you can do that.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the data that's currently collected for these permits is the right data?
It really depends. Some parts of the Corps the Corps has 38 different districts, and not every district works the same. Districts have different technologies and different thoughts and different needs. A district in New England is completely different from California than Hawaii and Florida, just to think about the extremes. So the data they collect, in many cases, it's required by the regs, but they can also modify it depending on their needs. But I do not believe there's a national data summary that looks at what are the decisions the Corps needs to collect. They do a great job of collecting permit data to see, how are permits collected. That was the database. There's been several iterations of Corps databases, and it does a very good job of collecting the information on Corps permits, wetlands, and things like that. But in terms of looking at things like cumulative impacts, I don't think we're there yet. I think there has to be some additional thought put into that. What is the cumulative impacts, and how do you make those decisions?
Yeah, cumulative impacts. There's a question from Anthony Fernando. I'm jumping in on you, Nancy, sorry.
That's okay.
How would the Corps guard against the risk of AI, ML, so ML's machine learning, norming the data it accepts, thus not detecting actual large delta changes in, say, assemblages?
Mm-hmm. Remember, AI and machine learning is only as good as what you program.
Yeah.
And how you teach it and set up the rules. So if you're trying to use it initially as a QA/QC, and it's almost, you use it more as a check.
Yeah.
Is it within the realm of you expect it? Then yes, it can be accepted. If it's not, then it's dumped out, and then the regulator has to check it.
Yeah.
The way I see it working initially is more of a checkbox.
Yeah.
At a certain level. Does it meet the kind of the criteria where it can be accepted?
Yeah.
And if there's anything potentially wrong with it, it kicks it out for the regulator then to look at. So
Yeah.
that way, if the regulator gets 1,000 data entries,
yeah,
he or she may only have to look at 100 instead
right.
of 1,000.
Yeah.
So not really trying to normalize or modify the data in any way. It's more of a first cut check. And then as we learn more about what data we need to collect and we understand better about what the pluses and minuses of AI machine learning, then we can evolve it from there.
Yeah.
Start small and build it out from there.
That gets to my Kristen's crazy ideas segment. And that is essentially, I think we've got 10,000 wetland determination forms in our database at this point. Is that a big enough data set for us to start using some AI ML and flagging things that are outside the norm? And is that something that would be beneficial even prior to sending it to the agency, say, so that the people collecting the data can see have an auto QA essentially? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the system, again, it depends on how you have your data set organized. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming it's in the cloud. I don't know. It's your business determination. But for you as a business owner, using some very basic AI machine learning techniques can be relatively cheap to do some basic review of the data to output things. So for example, if you have that embedded in your data stream and somebody enters a wrong term, it can be kicked out based on, again, some of the criteria you set up mm-hmm. and how the database is, because, the USGS data set is out there. Mm-hmm. So the location of those things are out there. You can access that, pull it into your system. Setting those algorithms up, again, would be an AI, would be a IT type cost that you'd have to make a business decision whether you want to add it or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it could be done relatively easily.
Yeah. And then it could be translated even to the core, given information to the core, like we flagged this or whatever to help with that process. Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting. Well, I did, I started the poll a little late, but everyone jumped on it. So thank you for that. And Jeff, can you see the poll?
I can see the poll questions. I actually can't see any results.
Okay, so maybe if I end the poll, can you see them, or is that just probably me then?
I think it's just you.
Okay. All right. So we've got 67% consultants on the call, and the next big is none of the above. So what are you guys then? Tell us in the chat, please. And then, what, Nancy?
I have a question, so keep going.
And then we've got 11% regulators and 6% permittees. We've got overwhelming support for creating the digital infrastructure, staffing, and culture within government to support the country's conservation, water, and stewardship priorities. It's over 50%, 67%. And then 66% of the folks would like to learn more about that. And I think we do have someone here from EPIC, so that's good for them to know.
We do.
Yeah, so we've got some law students and former regulators. Yeah, so some students essentially. Should put that in the list. What's your question, Nancy?
Well, so 67% of our people here today are folks who are, helping basically their customers get permits.
Yeah,
and they're doing that work. What advice could you give them, Mark, in terms of working with the Corps? And I think we talked a little bit about that in our pre-production, like what's the role of the Corps? What's the balance? Will there ever not be contention? And how can you help our customers be successful in what they're submitting to you? Or not to you anymore, but to the Corps, yeah.
Right. And I had two basic, when I was first as a regulator, I left the Corps after 5 or 6 years. I was in LA and I couldn't live on GS11 salary anymore in Los Angeles. And many of you in LA know what I'm talking about. But the two things I really wanted to make sure about is, number one, never lie to the regulators. And I know that sounds common sense, but many of the applicants want you to kind of maybe not lie outright, but bend the truth a little bit. And once you do that, you lose your credibility. So not lying to the Corps is really about credibility as a consultant. If you maintain your credibility that regardless of what happens, you're going to give the agencies a good answer, that helps. And what I found was when I did a delineation, I made sure I covered everything. And I told the applicants, you might have, based on my delineation, you might have another 10th or a 20th of an acre of wetland included. But what won't happen is the agencies won't question my delineation. That'll save you a month or 2 months from them getting out in the field and checking your delineation. Mm-hmm. And time is money to them. Yes. So doing it correct the first time and making sure you got everything in there every time is how you maintain that credibility and that reputation as a straight shooter. And then they will start trusting you, and that gets things done quicker, and that helps a lot. The second thing is I made a point of never going over a regulator's head. Mm-hmm. I knew some of the supervisors in the office, but what I tried to do is always work with the regulator. I never threatened. I never went to my old boss and said, hey, person X is not doing it right.
Yeah.
I maintained my relationship with the regulators.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And built the trust and made sure they understand. And you may not agree all the time, but at least you know where they stand and they'll tell you the answers and move forward. So as a consultant, having that reputation. And then if you have to go over, someone else will do it, or you hire someone else, or you have lawyers and they do that point. And you just stick to the technical and just maintain your credibility and reputation with the regulators. And that's the best way to make sure you maintain that reputation.
It's a relationship business.
Yes.
There's a really good question from Jeff Hartman. He's asking for suggestions/advice on how to provide the Corps with data outside of the paper copies of permit applications. What is useful for the Corps to have in their review?
Right now, you're going to have to submit it as either a DVD or some sort of digital that they can have and then use it in a system like that. In terms of what data, again, be careful you don't overwhelm the Corps.
Yeah.
Because 2 reasons. 1, they don't have a lot of time. And 2, not all of them are very good in GIS. Many of them are now. And they're smart people. They're essentially just like you as a consultant. If you put somebody on either side of that lens, they're the same people. And many of you have friends on both sides, whether you be regulators or consultants. So many of my friends were regulators and consultants both. So they're all work together. But remember the workload issue.
Yeah.
Regulator has to make a decision. So if you put too much information on him or her, then they feel like they're getting bogged down. They feel like you're trying to, put too much information to hide the stuff that's important.
Yeah.
So really focus on what's important. What does he or she need to make that decision? What's the information? Mm-hmm. Give him or her all the information, but don't put superfluous information out there that'll just burden them with having to wade through it.
Right. That was when I studied for the bar exam. You had to do these essays, and it was people reading them late at night to try to figure out if you should pass. And the idea was to write as little as possible and underline the key points. And that was it. Don't overwhelm them. So I think that's what you're saying, Mark.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think that collecting all approved delineations digitally in a GIS system, like some counties have done, could be helpful to improve the accuracy of NWI maps, understanding the mission differences between the Corps and the Army and the Fish and Wildlife? As now, the amount of ground truth data would be greatly increased.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw that from Mike Rolban, and he's a guy I know in Virginia here. And yes, I do think that's part of that inclusion of the digital data, with not only the NWI maps, but also the USGS wetland soil maps. Mm-hmm. Having those overlays and including that right now is very difficult for folks to do, but that's where this initiative that we talked about, the digital information, and overlaying that in a way that makes it easy to do.
Yeah.
And using AI and stuff like that to transpose those layers. Exactly, Mike's got the right idea. Mm-hmm. We now have the ability to collect a lot bigger pieces of data.
Yeah.
And that's where the machine learning and AI come in, helping organize that in a way that the regulator can still parse out the information he or she needs to make decisions. Mm-hmm. The information that the consultant can pull out in a certain small area to say, what's in the area that I'm looking at. I'm going to work with a consultant with a project in this area. What delineations have been done? What soil maps are there? What NWI maps are there? And that consultant can pull that information up pretty quickly to get a sense of what's happening.
Yeah.
And balance that with the regulator. Exactly.
Our very own Rini Punzi wonders if, do you think, Mark, that an automated system can help build the trust between the Corps and the consultant?
Yes, that's what I saw, is once you start basing information on data, and that's how I built trust with OMB.
Yeah.
You know, I met the OMB folks, I talked to them, and I said, here's our data.
Yeah.
And so I got them to understand the data they were seeing. And actually, I used Mike Rollband, to use his name again. We went out and did a site visit. We took the OMB folks with us out to look at some of these wetland sites to show how the data collected in the forms and in the office compared to what's actually on the ground.
Yeah.
And that's where you build that trust, and you're all looking at the same thing.
Yeah.
And if you as a consultant have all that data correctly and make it, clear to the regulator, he or she can then see everything's there and go, oh, yes, this is what's on the ground. This is what I see in the field. Everything's exactly the same. I can trust this consultant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to mess up this name. I know it already. I apologize. Leah Protopapadakis, great name. It looks like she works for the Corps. She says, FYI, due to the COVID pandemic, the Corps prefers not to receive anything by regular mail. Makes sense. Files are sent via email. Very large files can be sent using DoD Safe website. Individual regulators may have other options available. So don't be sending packets of COVID to people.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're past our time because I wanted to get those questions in, and
we'll do a brief demo after this for anybody who wants to stay on. And at this point, as a company, we've taken wetlands to heart, and we have developed not only the 10 regional forms in an electronic format that you can collect your data in the field and then export to that, and along with the photo export, but also CRAM, the California Rapid Assessment Method. For anybody who's on from California, we have 3 of those modules done. We also have a success criteria output that's Excel for those who are doing restoration work and mitigation banking. So we're really, am I missing anything, Jeff? I feel like there's one more in there.
Ordinary high water mark. Did you get that one?
We also have the ordinary, one of the 2 or forms. There's 2, and we have one of those in the system as well. That's for Arid West. And so if you want to stay on afterwards for a quick 10-minute, very high level overview, I'll run over kind of what that looks like in our system.
Okay. And we also had another question come up from an anonymous attendee. It says, what services do you see growing for apps besides wetlands regarding environmental services? Which feels like it's just teed up to pitch Wildnote here very quickly. And so my answer, I wrote it down, is that given that most environmental services include some level of field data collection, there are many areas that are ripe for utilizing an app, biomonitoring, stormwater monitoring, or SWIP, et cetera, all those sorts of things. And obviously, Wildnote supports many of those capabilities. And it's also a flexible platform that allows you to build your own survey forms to kind of, focus on any of the environmental services that you'd like. So thanks for teeing that up, whoever did. Appreciate it.
Awesome. One more question. I got the thank you Mark up here, and I did put his email address if you would like to contact Mark. Katie Wolf, this sounds very technical. What is the Corps doing to promote the hierarchy in the final rule, i.e. mitigation bank credits before ILF, before PRM, whatever that means?
I honestly, I hate to say this, I don't know. I haven't been in regulatory for several years. Yeah. I know when we wrote the rule, we put a preference for type of mitigation. Again, banks in lieu fees, and then project proponent mitigation, that is mitigation developed by the applicant. However, we also still have to give that flexibility. So I honestly don't know. I'd have to check, see if there's any guidance out there in Regal's or things like that in the core. And I haven't seen any, but I haven't checked recently.
Okay.
The last time I checked, I didn't see any out there that were any difference. And I don't know if there's any actual monitoring or data collection on that. But in the permit files, there would be, because there would be a, you know, how many mitigation banks were selected, how many in the fees,
right,
how many site specific. So
right,
you could get at that with data collection. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing your knowledge. Our next Lunch and Learn is July 13th. We call it Pushing the Past Forward, and it's for all you archaeologists, cultural resource folks out there. We'll have Kyle Sigalotti from Cultural Resource Management Limited. And that very same week, we are really excited to be guests on an ICF webinar called Technology Innovations and Data Sharing. They're doing some really cool stuff at ICF around this. And so John Walker and Lindsay Tunis from ICF will talk about remote technologies, and Christine Grosso from the San Francisco Estuarine Institute will talk about Eco Atlas, and then we'll get to talk about Wildnote. So 2 webinars in 1 week. Hopefully it's not a busy field week for you all and you can show up to those. And up to upcoming topics for us, we talked about our CRM. We're interested in doing one on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and mapping potentially some wind compliance, and then some very cool high-tech drones coming up here. So thank you very much, everyone. And I will now hand this over to Nancy to demo. I think you're going to demo the wetland delineation.
Yeah, I'm just going to give kind of a top level, show the kind of output that we have and a little bit about the platform itself. So,
okay, fantastic.
Yeah, so that's what we got. Let me get queued up here. There we go. Projects. Okay. All right. So there obviously are folks on this. Well, maybe everyone who's still here hasn't, doesn't know anything about Wildnote.
Right.
So I'll just talk about that. So Wildnote is a combination of a web-based cloud platform for environmental compliance, data collection and reporting, as well as a corresponding application that works on both iOS and Android devices. So basically, Wildnote is a project-based system. So what you see up here right now when you come into the application are a series of project cards. And a project is comprised of, who's working on the project with you, what level of access do they get to have to the data, so you can control access, data access that way. Which forms are you using for your field people when they're out collecting their data? Are there any documents that they need to have quick and easy access to? Those can be incorporated into the actual application on the mobile side for ease of use. No more backpack or box in the truck. We have a very robust taxonomy framework, which is particularly relevant to wetland work. So all 50 states USDA plant lists in, along with the latest 2018 core lists. And then some very specific and particular lists as well, having to do with native plant species in different states, that kind of thing. If you've got a taxon list that you want us to incorporate, get in touch with us. The beauty and the shine of Wildnote really happens on the QA, QC, and export side of things. And so we have a very great framework around that. We've got a dashboard. You can look at your data in what we call editable grid, which is a pivoted view of your data where you see all of it at one time, and in fact can do some actual editing in that view as well. So what happens essentially is you'll set up your project with the things that we've talked about, and then your field staff will download the app and they'll do their data collection, and then they will sync that data in. And as project manager, you can come in and then do your various things that you need to do for QA, QC and export of that data, including exporting to your regional forms. We also have a gallery view. This is just, a quick thing that I set up for this demo. So there's a gallery view of all the photos. Photo management's a huge thing, particularly with this kind of work, and people spend a lot of time on photo management. So we tried to take some of the sting out of that by creating some ready to go photo exports, 2-up, 4-up photo export pages, a very specific export for wetland. And then the ability to do things like search your captions. So if you need to find a particular photo that you that's in your project, we will rename all of the photos for you, which is a super tedious prospect for anybody. So Wildnote will do that automatically for you. So we have that aspect. And then we also have a very robust export framework, which I talked about a little bit. I think there's about 13 or 14 different exports. And exports that are specific to environmental type things in wetland would be the Army Corps export, this wetland photo export, the ordinary high water mark. We also have a species list export, which contains the metadata about the species. So if their listing status, their indicator status pops out into a nice pivoted view that you can incorporate as a table into any of your reports. So just a lot of variety and a lot of ways to get your data out for different initiatives that you might have for your customer. Let me pull up some examples of our output. We did recently develop CRAM. Let's see here as well. So here, I'll start here. So this is an example output for the Arid West region. Pops out just like you'd expect. Wildnote does all the heavy lift for you in terms of calculations. So you have in-app calculations for prevalence, dominance, FAC neutral, and rapid test if that's a part of your region. There are a lot of separate regional differences that we've accounted for in the application. We also have the Munsell soil list integrated in as a drop-down list that's smart searchable. Which is really helpful in terms of figuring out which 10YR you're in or other soil color types. I had a big education on soil colors this year, let me tell you. I'm getting down and dirty with that stuff. So this is what that looks like. Give you a real quick sense of what an output for our wetland photo export is. So within this is a report builder. So you do have the opportunity, if you have some intro information, you can put that in. As well as we will incorporate automatically your sampling point name or location name plus the date of the photo. It's a 4-up photo format, and we're constantly creating improvements on these things. Your company logo can be at the top and bottom, or your company logo and your customer logo can be on this. Paginated or not paginated, depending on how you're going to incorporate it into a final report. So that's photos, and this particular export could actually be used on any type of thing. It doesn't have to just be wetland. Then CRAM, we have created the exact CRAM output, and I'm very happy to report I got to go on a CRAM expedition, which was super fun for me. And in talking with, we've had about 20 people test this so far for riverine, slope, and depressional. And they've been just absolutely thrilled with the efficiencies that they've gained by using the tool. Not surprisingly in the field as well, because there's some helpful information in the digital format, particularly around plants. So this is the output for one of the, I think this is the slope output here, but you can see we've got the exact information just as the CRAM Level 2 committee has created for the scoring sheet. And then it follows with all of the different modules that make up the CRAM. So yeah, so that's just sort of a big picture of how, one other thing actually that I forgot about is the success criteria export. We've been working with several different mitigation banking companies who obviously work with the Corps as well in establishing success criteria for their banks. And we have, it's been an interesting challenge, and Kristen can chime in trying to figure out where are the consistencies across this large country that we have in terms of the type of data being collected and what the success criteria are. But we're starting to crack the nut on that. And what you're seeing in this spreadsheet is the first 4 tabs are actual data collected in the field. So this is field data, just pivoted, that comes right out of our system. You just click a button, I mean, literally 2 clicks and you've got your data in this format. And then what we're building for folks is the actual calculation of the success criteria based on the information that's being provided to us. So you can see that there's success criteria here. and this tab. And then we'll move over here. We've got some calculations that are happening there as well. And native comes in automatically, the indicator status, and obviously the species come in as well. And then you can see down here what's happening with this criteria as well. So success criteria greater than 50%, very quick view of that. So these are the kinds of things that you can get. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Nancy. Anyone out there doing mitigation banking, now's the time. If you could come forward and share with us the way you're sharing this kind of data with the Army Corps, because I am the pattern matcher, and I am trying to understand the various ways in which this data is being presented to the Army Corps so that we can get as close as possible to it coming right out of our system with less post-processing on your part. So that would be wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Kristen. Question from Josh Netherton. If you're going out to a delineation on a given day and you'd like some fields to autofill, are there settings for that? The answer is yes. We have something called default values. You can fill those in advance, and those will auto-populate when you launch a new instance of the form on your mobile device. In addition to that, if you have some, sample point to sample points really similar, you can duplicate the actual sample point. Let's say it's sample point 1. You can actually duplicate that completed form and then make your adjustments to that for sample point 2. So there's some nice field workflows that make things go a little bit faster. Is anyone looking at chat right now? Is there anything that we need to address in there?
Yeah, I am. Okay. I've been answering questions in chat. Katie Tierney asked if it works offline, and yes, it does. Wildnote works offline when you're collecting data in the field, and when you get back to internet connectivity, it uploads the data into our web app, where you can do your QA and QC and generate your report. So designed specifically for the way you all work.
All right. Any other questions? I think that'll wrap up this. Anyone who's interested in a more detailed deep dive, of course, we're always happy to offer that. And Jeff, maybe you want to share your connection information.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's simply jeff@wildnoteapp.com. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have some interest. I was answering things in the chat, so I didn't hear everything Nancy said, but one of the important things to realize is that because we've got everything set up, particularly for wetland delineation work in the platform itself already, if you've got a wetland delineation that you're doing, you can literally engage with the product on Monday and be out in the field doing useful work on Tuesday. So it's really quick process. By the way, you can do it on days other than Monday and Tuesday, but I should say it's if you do it day 1, you'll be out in the field day 2, and we also do offer a 2-week free trial, and so we would love to entertain you and have you try the platform. It would be fantastic.
We just set somebody up today, actually, earlier in the day on a 2,000-mile linear project that they're, having to delineate ahead of work. So, and they're starting that on Monday. So to your point, Jeff.
Yep.
Yeah.
They engaged with us last week, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah,
so
exactly. So
we can get you up and productive very, very quickly. Nancy's a whiz.
All right, Mark, thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you, Kristen.
Look forward to talking to you more about standardization and data. Yeah.